Broadcasting now.
Hello and welcome to Regenerative Resilient Food Systems Day. We're a key part of the Race to Zero dialogues. I'm Nisha Pillay and I shall be your moderator over the next hour and a half, the first session of today. So we want to say to you, wherever you're joining us from, whether by Zoom or whether on the YouTube live stream, please feel very welcome. We're offering you 3 languages for simultaneous interpretation. Spanish, Bahasa, and Chinese. You can access them from the bottom tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please feel part of the conversation. Send in your questions and comments, and I'll weave them through the whole day. So are we ready to start? I'm going to hand over now for some introductory comments to 2 high-level UN climate champions. They are, let me introduce them to you, Nigel Topping from the UK and Gonzalo Munoz from Chile, and also by Sue Pritchard, who is the CEO of Food Farming and Countryside Commission in the UK. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Nisha. And I'd also like to welcome the high-level climate champions, Nigel and Gonzalo, to Open Day 7 of the Race to Zero dialogues. The Food Farming and Countryside Commission works with a wide range of actors across the whole food system, from farmers and growers, governments, NGOs and business, and of course, citizens and civic society. It is great to see food and agriculture at the climate table. One challenge we see working across sectors as we do is about coming to some common ground on the right solutions and then the right metrics to measure progress, mindful, as that old saying goes, that we tend to manage what we measure. At FFCC, we've adopted the UN FAO definitions for agroecology as a set of principles and practices, and actually as a social movement for change. So Nigel and Gonzalo, I'd like to open with a question for you on the topic of regenerative agriculture, which we notice is increasingly recognised as critical to nature-based solution for reaching zero emissions. How do you define it? And then how would you want to measure progress against that definition? And then what does that say about the kinds of policies we need in place to manage for it? Let's start with you, Nigel.
Right. Well, thank you, Sue. It's wonderful to join. Can I start by, these dialogues that we're putting on are an exercise in radical collaboration. It's not like Gonzalo and I have the answer and we're trying to convince everybody. We're working with a great community. So thank you to FOLU, the Global Alliance for Future Food, Salzburg Global Cinema, WBCSD, World Farmers Organization, 4 in 1,000, CGIAR. CCAFS. I mean, it's a testimony, I think, to this community that everybody comes together. I should also say, Sue, that this is one of the reports I have on my desk, and in the first paragraph of chapter 1, you conclude what we eat and how we produce it is damaging people and planet. So it's very clear to me, Gonzalo, this is a nexus issue. It's not just about climate. It's about climate. It's about livelihoods. It's about health. It's about biodiversity. And of course, it's also about zoonotic diseases. I see David on the line. Hi, David. I know David's work's crossed all those issues. So I think the first thing to say is that we start from the point that we all understand that our current food and agricultural model is broken, as Danon would say, and that we need to shift to this paradigm of regeneration, which is based on more of a mindset of abundance than scarcity. And I mean, we very much defer to those of you who are much more expert, but in my sort of simple way of thinking about it, regeneration means designing systems so that they give more life, whether that's biomass or well-being. So life in those 2 senses of kind of physical life and lived experience, and which is the opposite of an extractive, plundering, over-exploiting paradigm, one which is in a kind of fantasy and an unsustainable way lived beyond the planetary boundaries that the scientists define to us. And we're very aware that our relationship with the natural world is the source of a quarter of emissions and could be the source of a third of the solutions in the short term. But also where this nexus means that we have to be very careful not to have a siloed view and not just think about the mitigation role, but also the biodiversity and natural and human resilience roles of a regenerative system. We're also very aware that we've used the term race to zero to give a sense of urgency and a clear goal, but of course zero is just a staging post on the way to regeneration. And I know there's lots of great examples of regenerative practice from around the world, and I'm really looking forward to today to hearing from all of you a lot more about that. I think that if we focus on those sort of simple definitions of increased biomass and more diversification, then that seems to me that probably leads the way to measuring regenerative agriculture. But I'm sure by the end of the day I'll have a much better answer to that technical question. So with that, I'll hand over to Gonzalo, who unlike me actually is a farmer.
Well, thanks so much, Nigel, and thanks Sue and the organizers. But yeah, being a farmer doesn't mean that I'm not also in the learning mood, right? I think that we're in a learning mood. There's so much that we're also discovering, and that's part of that should be in our mindset. Having said that, we know that there's no technical reason why agriculture shouldn't realistically be one of the world's most significant carbon negative, I prefer to say climate positive, economic activities. Also, when we speak about resilience, there's so many absolutely tangible benefits that are absolutely delivered through agriculture. So it should have been always in the center, right? We missed and we have lost some time, but we have to get those years back. We think that regenerative agriculture also hasn't scaled yet, because it should start scaling, mostly because investment is not on par with potential, and very little climate finance goes to agriculture. And that's something to be corrected. We're expecting to create some paths towards mobilizing a lot of efforts through and with agriculture. And second, this is compound with subsidies that, as Zach Goldsmith reminds us, are 4 times the global aid budget and not aligned with environmental social outcomes. So we have a problem there that we need to correct. We need to support farmers of all types as front and center of the agenda. That has been a mistake on not doing that. And farmers' knowledge and connection to the land, especially when it comes to small and indigenous farmers, is definitely overlooked. I think that there's a lot of this agenda that is about culture, education, training. We have been mistrained for so many years. We need to correct some basic mistakes that are being there for too long. And I say it very personally as well, right? And we know that policy needs to support an agriculture system that creates global public goods, not externally paid for by the public. And that is also something that is well connected to other areas of the climate agenda. Agriculture, we know, can contribute to net zero emissions by as much as 43 gigatons by 2030, according to Exponential Roadmap. So regenerative agriculture should become the new normal. We know that it requires a lot of changes, but we're here to help those changes become real. We know that this is nothing short of reimagining how we produce and consume food, but that's what it takes. And we have many real life examples that must scale up now in this decisive decade of action, and in which we must be nature positive, climate positive, regenerative by 2030.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Both a call to action and some really practical examples there, Gonzalo, about what needs to happen to bring this call to action to urgent reality. Over to you, Nisha.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you to Nigel and Gonzalo too for that uplifting message at the start of our session. Now, did you know, ladies and gentlemen, that almost a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions globally comes from agriculture and from land use change? Well, I certainly didn't. And what it means is that if we're going to meet our net zero climate ambitions, there's no way we're going to get there unless we transform food and agriculture systems. Now, that's exactly what FOLU, the Food and Land Use Coalition, has been trying to identify in its Growing Better report. 10 critical transitions to get us there, with economic development and a just rural transition at its heart, solutions which deliver for everyone. They're going to provide the backdrop, if you like, for our discussions in the session. We've got 2 panel discussions for you. The first is going to focus on why transforming our food and land use systems is absolutely essential to meeting our climate targets. And then the second is going to look at how non-state actors on the ground can take the lead on the zero emissions agenda and obviously also feed the planet. Now, that's a big ask, isn't it? So let's get started with our first discussion. I'm delighted to be able to welcome and introduce you to Craig Hansen, who joins us from Washington, DC. He's FOLU Principal and VP Food, Forest, Water and the Oceans for the World Resources Institute. From Nairobi, Kenya, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the Special Envoy for UNFSS, the UN Food Systems Summit, which is going to be taking place next year. From Geneva in Switzerland, we have David Nabarro, who, apart from his hugely important work as the Special Envoy to the WHO on COVID-19, is also Senior Advisor on the Food Systems Summit Dialogues, the 4SD. And from the UK, Andrea Ledward, International Biodiversity and Climate Director for the UK government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. Welcome to you all. Now, I'm going to start off by asking all our panelists to give us a very brief 5-minute overview on their thoughts on this very important subject. We will then open up into a panel discussion. I will fire some questions at them, but it's also your opportunity to send me your questions and I'll put them on your behalf. So we'll have a truly inclusive dialogue, I hope. First off now, I can see waiting very patiently in Washington is Craig Hansen. Give us your thoughts on how we can achieve this transformation of the food system, Craig.
Thank you, Nisha. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is a super important issue, and as Nisha mentioned, food and land use systems account for about a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. Many of us on the phone actually know that, but I actually firmly believe that a lot of people outside of this meeting actually don't. And so I think one task for us in the race to zero is to keep on communicating that message, that what happens in food systems and in land really matters in the race to zero. Most people think of climate change, they think of energy systems and transportation. They don't naturally think of what they eat and the agricultural lands and the forests that are around them. So I think part of our very first job here is to put this firmly on the agenda of everyone, that the food systems and land use is really fundamental to achieving not just our food security goals and human well-being goals, but also our climate goals. Secondly, we actually know what to do. Past several years, we've seen a flurry of research come out that actually starts to tackle and address the issues on food, on basically food systems and essentially how to get to the race to zero in terms of the food system. The World Resources Report by WRI, the World Bank, UNDP, and UNEP a couple years ago laid out a menu for a sustainable food future. And that menu lays out things to do on the demand side, like reducing food loss and waste and shifting diets. Things to do on the production side, like how to sustainably boost yields on existing agriculture and grazing lands. Things that combined could actually help liberate pressure on the natural forests and grasslands of the world, thereby helping to conserve and avoid emissions and the conversion of those ecosystems, which are important for indigenous communities as well as biodiversity, as well as liberating land to restore nature back, as well as restore productivity back to landscapes. That report was followed up by the Food and Land Use Coalition's Growing Better report, which found almost the same things. We're starting to hear a consistent message across research from scientists around the planet that we know what the solutions are. And Growing Better laid out its 10 critical transitions, Some of them starting with a nutritious diet. At the end of the day, that's what we want, nutritious food for all, underpinned by nature-based solutions, such as avoiding deforestation, sustainable agriculture, sustainable oceans, right? Food sustainably harvested from the oceans for humanity. Underpinning that comes a series of things that actually help with the demand side and help relieving pressure on food systems, such as reducing food loss and waste. Again, consistent messages on what needs to be done. And finally, one of the insights, I believe, of the Food and Land Use Coalition's Growing Better report was making sure this is grounded in human well-being. A regenerative food and land use system is one that has equal rights for genders, it generates livelihoods for farmers, right, and creates basically an engine of growth in the rural economy going over the next several decades. So it's a holistic vision. And I want to conclude by saying the next year, 2021, is now going to be the super year, right? There are 4 major events where these issues will be and have to be front and center of the agenda, right? We have, for instance, coming up the next Conference of Parties on the Convention on Biological Diversity, right? It's incumbent upon us as a community to get food systems and land use, how we feed ourselves, at the center of the CBD conference, because we know that land use change is the #1 driver of loss of biodiversity around the planet. So our community here, has the solution to helping to tackle the loss of biodiversity. The other great COP this next year is on climate. And clearly we have this race to zero has to be fundamental, right, to the Glasgow conference. And I think it's incumbent upon us all as well to bring transforming the food and land use systems, the 10 critical transitions, to the table when it comes to COP26 in Glasgow. There are also 2 others. The Food Systems Summit, first time ever, the UN bringing together our community to help put this firmly on the agenda for food security for all, nutritious food security for all. Again, this is a chance to blend the Race to Zero dialogue with the Food Systems Summit to help make a unified message. And finally, there's a Nutrition for Growth Summit in December of next year. Again, it's incumbent for us to bring this unified message to that global gathering as well. And so my plea to all of us is to have the same consistent, repetitive message in all 4 of the great global gatherings next year. So we basically entrench for the next decade this agenda for all, from governments to companies to everyday citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Well, that was quite a plea, wasn't it? Thank you for such a succinct and overarching overview for our discussion, Craig. Well, one of those big summits Craig was talking about is the UN Food Systems Summit. And aren't we lucky? We have the person who's responsible for delivering it, Special Envoy, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, joining us now. So, Dr. Kalibata, give us your vision.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Nisha, and thank you for those remarks, Craig, and the people that others that went before you. I come at this from a very simple perspective. Climate change is real for us here in Africa. Climate change is making it very difficult for farmers to get out of poverty, even as we're beginning to make serious headwinds out of poverty. So that's in the first place the reason I joined Follow, because I saw an opportunity to start engaging with partners, like-minded people, that we are looking at opportunities and the challenges we face to help us all come through. So that said, now the Food Systems Summit is here and probably provides the biggest opportunity of our lifetime. I want to come at this from a perspective of defending our food systems. I know many of us say our food systems are broken, our food systems are this and that. But you know what? Our food systems are also going to be the source of the solution to the problems that we face today. It will be based on the choices we make. It will be anchored in the type of choices we want to make. Our food systems have the capability to not only provide food, they have the capability to provide resilience. They have the capability to allow us to be more inclusive than we have seen with now COVID, what COVID has exposed. They have the capability to ensure that the world is fed. So what type of choices do we have to make today? 2 choices. One is what the moderator started with saying, have a common agreement of what is broken, or what's wrong, and that what we need to fix. 2, have a common agreement of what we can come through on. And I completely believe that we can come through on on the SDGs as we have signed up to. We signed up to them in the first place because we believed in the fact that mankind deserves the best. So we put our best foot forward. We came up with SDGs, but we are pretty behind on all SDGs. Zero hunger, we are very behind. We now have 60 million people that have gone hungry in the last 5 years alone. Nutrition, we now know that we have challenges with the food that we are eating and its contribution to malnutrition and all that. And we have come up in the Food Systems Summit, we have these objectives that we are looking at as things we need to come through on. The idea of definitely coming through on zero hunger, the idea of giving consumers better choices, the idea of reducing waste, but also the idea of coming through on emissions and reducing emissions, knowing fully well and recognizing fully well, as you said earlier, that we are contributing to emissions, but also the idea of better livelihoods for all and the idea of reducing and building shocks to resilience to the shocks that we're having in our system. So all these are deals that the food system is pursuing, but these are things that are also existent in all these other summits, whether it's the biodiversity summit and focus on reducing biodiversity loss. All these are things we all care about. What does the Food Systems Summit offer that we must focus on? The Food Systems Summit offers an opportunity for all of us to come together and agree on how to move forward together. That's why we have the food systems dialogues that will take place at country level that David will be talking about. But more importantly, that's why we are tapping into all these non-state actors, the champions, the civil society. We have challenges mobilizing civil society, but we definitely want civil society to be part of who we are. We are one world, we are one people, we have one problem that is facing us. Our globe needs us to act better, to do better. And we need to come together and agree on a direction forward. The private sector is so critical to what we are doing and where we are going. And we are engaging them. And we want to make sure that by the time we come to solutions at the end of the day, we have actually engaged everybody. But more importantly, listen to this, more importantly, each of us makes a decision to eat 3 times a day. You've probably heard me say this, but I can't say it enough times, because each time we make a decision to eat, we are impacting our food systems. So more importantly, we must reach everybody. That's why we have put an independent dialogue in place that will allow people that can't dialogue at country level to be able to dialogue. That's why we have put a digital platform in place that will allow anybody that wants to reach us in place to reach.
Dr. Kalibata.
That's, yeah, and let me conclude with this. We need everybody to engage. This is a 7 billion people engagement. This is all of us must engage to be able to transform. And the UN Food Systems Summit offers an opportunity for the whole world to agree on one thing. So I invite you to be part of this.
We wholeheartedly agree. Thank you very much for issuing the invitation. I'm now going to pull in David Nabarro from Geneva to join us. He's doing such vital work on the COVID pandemic at the WHO. Tell us why you're involved in this issue, David, which is about nutrition and health. Now, do we have a link with David Nabarro? Is he with us yet?
He's on mute, maybe.
Are you possibly on mute, David? I'll tell you what, while we're sorting out our link to David Nabarro, why don't I hand over to Andrea Ledward from DEFRA, the UK government department, which is responsible for agriculture and the environment. It's all in one building. Andrea Ledward, you're International Biodiversity and Climate Director for the department. Give us your thoughts on the importance of transforming the way in which we produce our food.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak today about really largely the Nature Campaign, which is a key part of COP26 about agriculture subsidies. And I'll talk a bit about the importance of a just rural transition. So I've spent the last few years working domestically in the UK. Some of you might know that I've been working very much on the Environment Bill that's currently in Parliament, working on the agricultural transition, on new environmental land management programme, and putting in place the basics of a new agricultural and environmental systems in the UK. And now I'm very delighted and privileged to lead the DEFRA team on biodiversity and climate and the overall kind of international nature strategy across government. So we're at a really crucial point in history, which really is a point of no return, and there's no room for doubt that biodiversity, climate and social justice are inextricably linked. We need a land revolution on the same scale as the transition to clean energy, and a revolution with people, the planet and prosperity at its heart. But meeting that challenge will really require ambition, and it will require a lot of action. So at the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit, the UK, the World Bank, the Food and Land Use Coalition and others brought together government, companies, research organisations and civil society groups to focus on the just rural transition. We reflected that the OECD estimated that 51 countries that produce 2/3 of the world's food provide over £705 billion in public support to agricultural producers. And much of that is not designed to take climate and environmental impacts into account, and much of it results in harmful, destructive impacts to nature. So with public finances under strain, we feel very strongly that it's vital that the vast public support that is available is targeted to address these challenges and not to create harm. So shifting this support towards sustainable land use, prosperous rural communities and nature conservation is really key to ensure that land use is compatible with the Paris Agreement and also with the SDGs. And it's a chance for developed and developing countries alike to go on this same learning journey and to support each other in these efforts. So the UK is committed to funding a World Bank partnership, providing developing countries with technical assistance to begin planning how to repurpose their subsidies. And we hope that an increasing number of countries will start to look at the public support provided to agriculture and repurpose it towards a regime benefiting climate, nature and people. This mirrors the approach we're taking in England and Wales. Last week, the Agriculture Act got royal assent, and that is the basis of how we're going to be giving farmers the support they deserve in the UK to feed their nation, help nature recover and make our country more resilient to a changing climate. The task ahead is to see them through the transition to a more innovative, profitable and sustainable future. In England, we're phasing out untargeted direct payments over a 7-year transition and introducing new schemes paying for environmental and animal welfare outcomes, co-designing the scheme with farmers, land managers and stakeholders from a range of environmental organisations. We're also going to be providing support for farmers to use new technologies and improve their productivity and produce high quality food in an increasingly environmentally sustainable way. COP26 provides an opportunity for us to make progress on the agenda and provide more collaboration and learning between developed and developing countries. And I hope that we can go on this journey together. And some of our key priorities for the COP26 Natures campaign are going to be about securing enhanced political commitment to adopting nature-based solutions and policies and programmes, including through nationally determined contributions. Coming behind the Leaders Pledge for Nature, we now have 76 heads of state who signed up to the Leaders Pledge for Nature.
2, 3.
We want to scale up private public finance. We want a new dialogue between agricultural producer and consumer countries. We'll drive forward the protection of marine ecosystems. We will demonstrate bold action in domestic policies, support the just rural transition. But all the time, as Craig said, it's important that we join things together. So next year, we'll be focusing very much on joining together the Convention on Biological Diversity, the COP26 campaign, and also the UK's presidency of the G7, where we'll be using that very much to have a strong focus on nature, climate and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that canter across a huge subject. What I take away from it is joining things together next year while UK has the leadership of the COP26. Well, I'm sorry you were interrupted momentarily by David Nabarro, who was doing a sound check, but the good news is that David Nabarro is with us. So thank you for pulling away from your important work at the WHO on the COVID pandemic. David, tell us why you think that this issue of nutrition is so important to health and why you're involved in this movement at this point. Do we have a link with David Nabarro? David, are you with us? I'm hoping that we can switch to you so that you can give us some thoughts at the start of our discussion. Are you with us? Okay, so it looks like we're having some difficulties with reaching David Nabarro. So instead, how about we do this? I will start the panel discussion, and then when David Nabarro is ready, he can join us. I'm sure someone will flag it up. Are you with us, David Nabarro? I see you moving your hand. Are you ready to give us your opening thoughts? He might be on mute. Am I the only person who can't hear David?
I can't hear him either.
Okay, so I'll tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, we're going to have to iron out our technical problems. In this world of COVID, we are always confronting this kind of issue, and it's kind of ironic that our COVID czar has thrown them into our meeting. Let's continue with our discussion. Since you're in front of me on my screen, Craig, I'm going to ask you about resilient agriculture. Now, we heard a lot about it right at the start from our two UN climate champions. Is that really the way? Is that the silver bullet that's going to transform the ag system for us and get us to our ambitions? Or do we need to be realistic and do a whole lot more?
Great question. I actually don't believe in silver bullets, right? I'm more the silver buckshot type of person, right? We need a lot of different things to get there. And I think if you look at all the great scientific research the past 3 years. I really would say the past 3 years, we've seen just this explosion of research on this issue of how are we going to sustainably feed the planet without destroying it in the process. None of them have a one-stop solution, right? It's a portfolio. When it comes to agriculture, I do believe the world needs to produce more from the same land sustainably, right? That's how you reduce pressure on deforestation and conversion of savannas, which is important for climate mitigation, avoiding emissions, as well as saving biodiversity, as well as protecting indigenous peoples. At the same time, we need to ensure that the food system is actually resilient to the impacts of climate change that in many parts of the planet are already here, as well as impacts of other things, such as a COVID crisis, right? And I do think, so therefore we need to have build in resilient agriculture, whether it's in terms of what you grow where, how you grow it, practices that actually conserve water, because if climate change is your shark, water is its teeth, right, in terms of how the world experiences it. So we need agricultural systems to be able to withstand these shocks that are already here and are going to only just grow. And so I do think this resiliency in the ag system is fundamental from a mitigation as well as an adaptation perspective. So fundamentally important, but it can't be everything.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're clearly going to have to do some very complicated joined up thinking to try and transform our food and land use systems. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and see if we can cross over to Geneva now and have one more go at connecting with David Nabarro. Third time lucky. David, are you with us?
Can you hear me, please?
We can. Sigh of relief. Please tell us what you think is so important about today and why you're involved in this. Briefly, if you don't mind.
Thanks very much, Nisha. I've been working at the interface between health, nutrition, and food for the last 40 years. But recently, I've become totally committed to working with communities as they find ways to shift their food systems. What you've heard already in the presentations is a very clear statement of what needs to be done. And there is this brilliant report called Growing Better by FOLU that joins many others on showing the pathway. But it's one thing to know what needs to be done. It's quite another thing to actually contribute to the more than 2 billion people who work in food systems around the world to contribute to the transformation of food systems that will make them good for people and planet. I mean, at the moment, too many of our foods are not good for our nutrition and health. Too many of our foods are damaging the environment. Too many food production systems are contributing to climate change. Too many farmers are going into debt and experiencing really serious mental ill health. But to make the changes can't be done simply by giving instructions from one central place or writing reports. We all have to be part of the movement for change. And that's why I've been working for the last few years on developing a system of dialogue which enables people with very different points of view to shift their position and to come together around shared challenges. It's not easy work, and quite often the dialogue leads to massive disagreement. Sometimes people refuse to sit at the same table or even to meet each other. But if we're patient and if we sustain the process of dialogue in communities, in subnational areas like cities or provinces, in countries, in regions and globally, and we do that dialogue in tens of thousands of places around the world, there is a possibility, and we know it can happen, that people will come together and work together for change rather than being locked in constant dispute. We will not change anything through constant dispute, but we will change when we find ways to work together. That's
David Nabarro, thank you very much. I'm going to open up to questions now. We've already got some coming in from our audience. Please send in some more, ladies and gentlemen, otherwise I will hog all the questions and we don't want that. Here's the first one from Isabella Teixeira from Brazil. And she says, it's relevant to discuss the challenges of the tropical agriculture system, building resilience and low carbon agriculture there. Could we share more on this? And I'd like to put that question to Dr. Agnes Kalibata. Agnes.
Thank you. I mean, I work in the tropical agriculture system, so I definitely understand the challenges. I think two challenges that I see people face the most. One is definitely, at least in my part of the world, very low input use agriculture that really takes very little into consideration when it comes to how soils get managed for better. And as a result, most of the production that happens in our part of the world comes from using more land. And I think there's an opportunity to find the right balance in terms of what you said earlier, regenerative agriculture, and really ensuring that we find ways of returning stuff to the land so that the land can be able to give us better. So that is one of the biggest challenges, very low input use, as a result, very low productivity, and then so much more degradation that leads to now a continent as big as South America that is degraded because of agriculture. The second,
can I just bring in Andrea Ledwood on that briefly, and then I'll come back to you, Agnes. So Andrea Ledwood, would the UK government be prepared to finance that? Because in order for poor farmers in tropical parts of the world to change their systems, they're going to need some help.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think through the UK Overseas Development Assistance, through our International Climate Finance portfolio, I think the UK is very committed to supporting financially the just rural transition and working on stopping the drivers of deforestation. And we are learning from what we're doing domestically. We realise that nobody's got a magic kind of bullet, as Craig said, nobody's got an answer, and everything is very locally specific. So it is very important to understand the local governance, the local land rights, the local kind of drivers and the local economic drivers in particular countries without assuming there's a single solution that can apply everywhere. And certainly is what we're finding here in the UK as we are facing kind of multiple struggles for our land. We need more land for housing, more land for tree planting, we want to restore our peat, we need more land for to improve our productivity. And so it's about a dialogue. It's about working out what is the best use of the land that is there available. But for the first time, really factoring in nature and climate outcomes in a way.
But it's also about money, isn't it, Andrea? So that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
Agnes, sorry I interrupted you. Please give us the second thought of your, your thought on building resilience in tropical agriculture.
So the second part recognizes that tropical agriculture is probably one of the most eroded systems in the world because of heavy rains and long centuries of agriculture. So it's related to the first one. If we don't find ways of supporting these systems to ensure that they are more resilient, and there are now a number of ideas that are beginning to come up from an agroecological perspective that really look at some of the resilience perspective that we can put in place, and regenerative agriculture again offers some of the opportunities, but these have to be put in mainstream agriculture. They're still outside mainstream agriculture. These ideas are new, and people we have to build a system of educating people on the value of these ideas and how they can survive with them and how they can be part of building back from a land perspective, building back better.
Thank you very much, Agnes. So a question now from Elise Buckle from Planetary Emergency. And I think I'm going to put this question to Craig Hansen first. Firstly, there's lots of praise, loving this session, radical collaboration, blah, blah, blah. But here's the question. What are the actionable solutions you would like to see being scaled up and that can be scaled up before and after the UN Food Systems Summit? Give us something positive, Craig.
Oh, great. Great question. There's a lot, but I'll pick a couple. To me, a no regrets solution is reducing food loss and waste. It's on everyone's agenda, right? Every report that came out says with the humanity, we grow so much food, yet a third of it doesn't make it into a human mouth, right? And that's just a moral travesty as well as an efficiency travesty. And there's positive news. The United Kingdom actually is the first country to make it halfway to the SDG target 12.3, the SDG target that calls for the world to cut in half the rate of food loss and waste by the year 2030. The United Kingdom is now halfway there to doing that. From farm to fork. It can be done. There are a number of companies now, major companies in the food supply chain, that have cut their food loss and waste by more than 30% over the past 3 years alone, right? It can be done with concentrated effort. It's a win-win-win. There's probably a fourth win in there, right, with reducing food loss and waste. That's one thing. It's one of the 10 critical transitions. A second one is what we like to call kind of produce and protect, right? This combination of sustainably feeding the planet, boosting yields, ranging from improving soil health to boosting productivity per hectare, which increases livelihoods for farmers, while at the same time, right, conserving, protecting, and restoring the natural ecosystems, right? Back to what Andrea was talking about. There's a race for land going on, right? That means we need to use land most optimally. So that combination of produce and protect, I think, is another win-win-win scenario that has to be pursued.
Thank you, Craig. Now, here's a question that's come in from Eugene Clark, which I think will be right up your street, David Nabarro. It says the Eat Lancet Commission report from 2019 showed that a change in diet is needed to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, don't we know it? But this is unlikely to happen. Consumer behavior is unlikely to change without quite a lot of prodding. So he's going to ask you about regulation. What is the role of regulation in all this, is his question to you. Are you optimistic anything is going to happen? And what can regulation achieve? David. I think we're having problems connecting with David again. Can we try again? David Nabarro? No, we're not having any luck with him there. Okay, we'll park that question for a moment, and I'm going to ask you another question now. And this comes from Japan this time. And it's from Naoko Ishii, who says, I hear arguments that due to COVID-19, we need to shorten the food supply chain to make the supply chain more resilient. But I have doubts about this argument. It may leave quite a number of smallholder farmers left behind, while not really helping the resilience of food systems. What is your view? Andrea Ledwood, may I ask you that?
It is a very live debate, and there's a big question, especially in COVID, which I think has led people to focus more on their local food systems as there's been shocks through the system. I don't think it is an either or clearly one or the other kind of answer here. I think we do need global food systems to work. We need more transparency through those systems, and we want to be greening our supply chains and greening the kind of systems as they come through. But it's absolutely critical for many developing countries that are on a trajectory and a growth trajectory to be able to export their food and to be part of global markets. And so we would very much support that. But in the UK, at the same time, we are supporting kind of people eating locally and understanding where their food comes from. And also at the same time, eating locally as well. So I think it's both. And I think we need to strengthen all the systems. But as Craig said, what we need to be doing is reducing the waste that's coming through those systems and increasing the transparency about what's coming through and improving the quality of the food that's coming through those systems, as David said, to improve the nutritional content.
Does anyone else want to chew on that question before? Otherwise, I'll bring in another one. Does anyone else have a slightly different, more nuanced view on that? Okay, I'm going to bring in a question from YouTube, from someone who hasn't identified themselves. In terms of the just rural transition, do you favor stronger local and regional food systems Or do you want to see more food traded globally? Dr. Kalibata.
That's similar to the previous question. Let me try to get a go at that. I mean, it's like Andrea said, it's not either or. I think there's a place for shorter supply chains and a place for longer supply chains. Let's remember this, that before COVID, we had a system where a lot of the world, there's a huge part of the world that does depend on the trade system, on the trade environment we have created. That part of the world will suffer if we decide to say, okay, all of us become inward looking. Part of what will save our world will depend on optimizing what we do well. There are places of the world where they can't grow what they need, and they will depend on trade for us, for them to get what they need. So we cannot interfere with that because we'll be putting more stress on our environment. Just imagine Saudi Arabia trying to produce wheat. What type of stress will put on the environment? So those are some of the challenges we need to think through, even as we think through reducing the size of the length of supply chains.
Thank you so much, Agnes. I want to put some questions to you of my own, if you don't mind, which I don't think we've addressed so far. I heard a lot earlier on as we were running through our opening statements, this idea of coming together. Have we got David Nabarro with us? Fantastic. So I'm going to put a question that came specifically to you. Let me see if I can find it, and then go to my own thoughts. And it comes from Eugene Clark. The Eat Lancet Commission report from 2019 shows that a change in diet is vital to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This requires consumers to change the way they eat, their consumer choices. But are you optimistic that this can happen without regulation playing a part? Is there a role for regulation?
Thanks very much indeed. Sorry for the sound problems. Of course, there are lots of reports now about what people should eat to be good for their health and good for their planet. But there are many reasons why people do not eat what is good for them. Most of those are to do with the fact that good food is more expensive and is often not available in many parts of the world. And that's because of structural reasons. So the big shift that's going to happen requires political consent. If we're going to use regulation to help that shift, then that also has to be based on political consent. If people vote in governments that are against regulation, then there will not be regulation. My comment, therefore, Nisha, to the questioner and to others is food choices, food transformation is both technical and political, and we need to be comfortable working with both sides of the coin. Thank you.
I'm beginning to realize what a complicated area this is, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a question I have for you. I've heard throughout the session so far, we need to come together. This is complicated. We need to work together. Next year presents huge opportunities with all these important summits coming up. But frankly speaking, environmentalists tend to vilify farmers and the ag community. You don't have a great history of talking to each other, do you? So how are you going to change this? How are you going to find a common language and common respect for each other, really? Who would like to chew on that question?
I think
Andrea, go for it. Okay, well, I'm going to...
Oh, Agnes, go on.
Andrea, go, please.
I was just going to say, I mean, certainly the conversation debate we've been having in the UK is very much that farmers are the managers of the land. In most cases, over about 80% of England is farmed land. So most of the land, it's the farmers who day to day are walking on those fields, who are making the choices about what happens in those fields. But as David has said, it's structural reasons and incentives that are leading the farmers to behave in a particular way. So what we need to do is work in partnership with the farmers who care deeply about what happens on their land to reform the incentives that are set there, many of which are quite hard to think differently about. So the agricultural subsidies that are in place that are paying people per hectare of land that they own, or paying them to put fertilizer on the land, or paying them to do certain things, or to take out certain trees so they can get big machinery in. We just need to change those incentives, and therefore this is why it's about paying for potentially the environmental outcomes that come, the animal welfare outcomes, and not paying just for through for the food that's produced, which leads to a very linear kind of set of calculations made by the farmers that are putting the food on that land.
And that's not an easy just, is it? Changing the subsidy system, as we all know. The UK is trying to do that, and let's hope that other countries begin to step up to that challenge too. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry we're out of time. It's been such an interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us, Craig Hansen, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, David Nabarro fitfully, and Andrea Ledwood. It's been a pleasure having you with us on Regenerative Resilient Food Systems Day. Now, let me introduce you to our next set of panelists without further ado. We're going to now be looking at non-state stakeholders and what they can do to take the leadership in these climate action areas. And we have with us, joining us from Beijing, Dr. Li Fang, Director for China for the World Resources Institute. From Lagos in Nigeria, Ndidi Noneli, Chair of Nourishing Africa. From the Netherlands, Agnes Johan, Head of Blended Finance at the big ag bank, Rabobank. And from India, Ajay Veer Jakhar, the Chair of Bharat Krishi Samaj, the Farmers Forum of India, who I think is joining us from New Delhi. Welcome to you all. Now, like in the previous panel, I'm going to ask each of you to give us a brief 5-minute overview on your thoughts on what non-state actors can do to mobilize change. And I think I'm going to start by asking Dr. Fang to start us off. Give us a Chinese perspective.
Hello, everybody. Very nice to meet you all. I want to got this idea from President Xi announced that China's new pledge on 2030 and 2060 that China achieved the carbon peak before the 2030 and also achieved the carbon neutrality before 2060. China's commitment on net zero is the most ambitious climate pledge ever over the world. This means that China needs to cut its carbon emission from about 16 billion tons every year down to net zero within 40 years. It has only 30 years to go from peaking emission to net zero, less than developed country in Europe and North America. This is a huge challenge and cannot be achieved easily. What I have been asked is if it is reality or serious. We can easily observe in China. China has taken serious actions such as optimizing industrial and in energy sectors, structures like saving energy and improving efficiency and increasing forest carbon sink in the past decades. China now ranks #1 global in terms of investment, installation, and electricity generations in renewable energy. The byproducts of these actions is that air quality is also improved significantly. By the end of the 2019, China's carbon emission intensity have decreased by 48% comparing with the 2005. What achieved is not only the emission target. China is in the kind of a crossroad. 2020 is the connecting years. 40 years ago, the China made economic and social development master plan. So milestones every decade, China achieved all of its goal. Looking forward, China is going to make 14th five-year plan, breaking down the goals for next 40 years into each industry and each province's sectors. So that is what we can see right now. We can choose, and today we.
I think we might have a slight freeze on the line to Beijing there. Why don't we why don't we move on and introduce Dr. Fang into the discussion a little bit later on. Do we have Ndidi Nweli with us? I'd like to hand over to you if we've got a good clear line to Lagos and Nigeria. Ndidi, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me clearly?
Perfect. Do give us your overview on what you think smallholders can do, what you think entrepreneurs can do, non-state actors to engage with this important agenda and create real change.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Folu for this opportunity. You know, climate change is real on the African continent. And in fact, of the 10 countries considered most threatened by climate change globally, 9 are in Africa. The recent floods, droughts, and locust infestations that have plagued most of the continent over the past few years.
Ndidi, I'm going to stop you there just for a moment and interrupt you just for a minute. Sam, on technicals, can we switch the image so that we pick up Ndidi on the screen? Because I can't see her and possibly the rest of our audience can't see her either. Can we get, there we go. Thank you very much. We weren't able to see you and into the whites of your eyes. Ndidi, please pick up again.
All right, thanks. I was just saying that climate change is a very real situation on the African continent. And of the 10 countries considered most threatened by climate change globally, 9 are in Africa. Over the last few months, we've experienced floods, droughts, locust infestations, all linked to climate change. And definitely farmers have a critical role to play, so do SMEs and women in particular. When I looked at the Folu report, I mean, 3 things stood out for me: the productive and regenerative agriculture, which the last panel talked about, the importance of strong rural livelihoods, and the critical role of gender and demography. I think there are 3 critical steps we must take. First, we have to raise broad-based awareness. I have to confess that most of the SMEs that I interface with do not worry about climate change. They know it's there, it affects them, but they just don't know what to do about it. So recruiting and equipping climate champions is critical. Raising awareness, communicating in language that the SMEs and the farmers can understand, and then equipping them with the skills and tools and support they require to really understand how to navigate, mitigate, and adapt is really important. And this is where extension support comes in. In most of our countries, we still have very weak extension services. And so there's very limited engagement with the farmers. And where there are seeds and tools to enable them adapt, they don't have them, they can't afford them, and they can't adopt them. The second is that we have to ensure an enabling policy framework. Sometimes from the West, we have such high bars that have been set because many of the agricultural ecosystems in the West have moved far ahead with use of technology, but you cannot impose those same policy frameworks in many of our emerging economies. And there's a need to adapt those frameworks, to localize them, and to ensure that they're applicable and they're not too costly for many emerging economies to meet up, because we did not contribute to climate change as much as many of the Western countries, and yet we're definitely dealing with the ramifications. And finally, we have to minimize the double standards. I think that we still see the South and the North as different platforms, and there's a need to ensure a level playing field, and to this whole concept of carbon credits, where they are sourced, where they are applied, needs to be addressed. And also the importance of innovation and technology and making it cost effective for smallholder farmers and for SMEs to do the right thing, to be climate smart, and to adapt in this current landscape. I think that is really critical. I'm working across the board, leveraging a lot of these through many of my initiatives, and I'll be happy to share them as we progress the conversation. Thank you very much.
And we'd be happy to hear more from you. Ndidi, thank you very much for now. So we were talking here, she was talking about the importance of cost effectiveness, the importance of the rich world recognizing that the poor world is having to do a lot of heavy lifting that they're not responsible for. And that brings us very nicely into introducing Agnes Johan from Rabobank, the head of blended finance there. How do you see the role of finance in trying to address some of these big issues, Agnes? Now, do we have Agnes Johan on the line? I suspect we don't, but I can see on my screen, at the very top of my screen, Ajay Veer Jakhar, the chair of Bharat Krishi Samaj, the Farmers Forum of India. And I think he might be ready to jump in and give us his overview of whether small and big farmers are really engaging with these issues and what we need to do. Maybe pick up from some of those points Ndidi made for us, Ajay, please. Can we swap to giving Ajay some sound, please? Ajay, we can't hear you. And but can we put Ajay in full screen if possible? At the moment, I can only see you as a very tiny icon. Sam, can you bring Ajay into the full screen, please, and sort out his sound? Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear. And we're just seeing a still picture. So perhaps we're having internet signaling problems, but with a bit of luck, we'll see you in vision.
So, okay, I think so I should just begin because we're running out of time.
Go for it, Ajay.
So as a farmers organization, I think we don't have much time. That has been mentioned before. And achieving a net zero emissions is also not enough because human activity has doubled the carbon dioxide in the air since the beginning of the industrial age. And most of this increase has come since 1980. And that is also the time that the world became aware of this problem, that there is a carbon emission problem. And since then, it has become worse in spite of all the programs we've had. A lot of conversations say that 1/4 of the greenhouse gases are given by farmers because of their farming practices. So we need to design a strategy not only to limit the emissions, but also to capture the carbon. And that's the best way to do it, to capture carbon, is in the soil. So as a farmers organization, I want to raise 4 specific pain points of why we are not succeeding, why we are failing. The first is that I want to raise 4 questions that I think so the world must be asking if we need to solve this problem. The first is, who taught us farmers to farm the way we do, the way we add carbon emissions to the atmosphere? Now, till we don't question and address such problems, we will not have an answer. The answer is very simple. It is the CGIAR system. It's the big agriculture private sector companies. It is the government programs that taught us how to farm in such a way. So we need to unlearn what we have been taught for generations to enable us to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere and to capture carbon. My second point is that we are constantly told that we are responsible for this mess. And we are also told that soils can capture carbon. But when we talk to farmers, 99% of them will tell us that it is not so, that they do not know about net emissions or carbon emissions or net zero targets that the world has set for itself. Now, just imagine a small farmer in Africa or in India. He feels pride that he's able to feed his family, he's providing food security for his country, and he's working hard for it. Now, just imagine all the educated people like us go to this farmer and tell him that you are responsible for the existential crisis that the world is facing, and you are the problem. He's not going to believe it, and that's the second problem. The third problem I feel is that we need farmers to change their practices to capture carbon and stop emitting greenhouse gases. Is the farmer going to change his practices in the present circumstances? My answer is no. He's so busy getting money to feed his children, mustering money for medical expenses of his parents and grandparents. He has economic priorities. And the way the food systems has developed in the world, way the West is giving subsidies, driving down farm gate prices, the small farmer in most of the world is hand-to-mouth condition, just barely trying to make his meat, is not going to care about net emissions at all. So we come to the final point that I'm trying to make, which is that it requires a lot of funds to make this transformative shift. Now, where are these funds going to go? Which programs are these funds to? Various governments, multilateral academicians and large are funding these funds back to themselves. And very insignificant small proportions are coming to farmers to capture the carbon or to change practices. If you see in the past 20 years, various programs have come from various multilateral organizations, World and others, about rewarding people to help industries to change their practices. But like they haven't, and it has not worked. It's like asking the Ripper, murdering and helping to murder.
Ajay, we're having a bit of problem hearing you there. The line is degrading a bit. So I'm going to introduce Agnes Johan, who I think is with us. Can we have, yes, good. Can we hear Agnes? Can you give us a financial perspective on all this? Because we keep hearing from people, we need the money to create the transformation. Agnes,
yeah. Can you hear me or not? Because things seem to switch all the time. Excellent. Thank you very much.
See you. So can we, Sam, can you please put Agnes
we have some
into
technical
vision?
issues all the time, I think.
Okay, can we put Agnes into vision? If not, just please go forward.
Can I just start? Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks. So I'm Agnes Johan, and I'm heading indeed the blended finance team at Rabo Partnerships, which is part of Rabobank. So yeah, finance is indeed always a part of the question, I guess. And I would like to just take a few minutes to explain what Rabo does, and also to indicate where we try to mitigate climate risk. So Rabobank is one of the leading food and agri banks in the world. We finance from farm to fork, as we say, and we are operating in the midst of today's challenges. So climate change, disrupting growth seasons, soil quality declines, and the increasing global population that needs to be fed. So we believe that the transition towards sustainable food production is really key going forward. So early on, we identified that some of the sustainable food transitions actually require a financing solution that embeds a very high risk or long tenor or something complicated. So this is higher than would be normally acceptable within a commercial bank. Just to make it a bit more tangible, we would, for example, if you're financing a non-cash flow generating activities like forest protection, or improving soil quality, which takes a long time, or financing the really small farmers to allow them to improve the yields, or financing plantation renovations. These are projects that usually commercial banks would not be able to finance. So blended finance is where we could combine the public funding with the commercial funding that's available. So it would allow us to actually share part of the risk with other partners. And in these financing solutions, we would embed environmental and social impact. So building on that idea of blended finance, UNEP worked together with Rabobank and FMO, which is the Dutch Development Bank, and IDH, which is a Dutch NGO. We've set up the AGI3 fund. It's a fund that is set up to de-risk commercial banks, to unlock financing to transactions that either combat deforestation, increase sustainable agriculture, and improving rural livelihoods. So de-risking in this case means that the commercial bank would, the fund would participate into transactions of a commercial bank. Rabobank has taken the lead in this initiative. We've set up the fund, but we also realize that even though we are a big food and agri bank, the challenge is much bigger than Rabo's portfolio alone. And this is why the fund is set up outside of the bank. The AGI3 fund is managed by independent fund managers and is an open architecture fund, so it's also open to other commercial banks. So the fund is live. It's also partly funded. We're still seeking investors, but now our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the GEF and Rabobank itself, are the investors. So my team is the blended finance team, and we work on structuring these AGI3 transactions with our clients. And I thought it's maybe nice to mention a few tangible examples. So for example, in Brazil, where Rabobank has a large network of financing farmers, we focus on pasture land renovations for cattle, which means that we are going to semi-confined feedlots, rotating, improving the pasture land, but also increasing the productivity. And for soy, where we do some innovative production method financing to see if it actually lengthens or maintains the soil quality for a longer period. And all these deals are combined with forest protection and increased forest code adherence requirements. In China, for example, we work with a fertilizer distributor company who is seeking to engage with quite a large number of smaller farmers to increase their income by adding a cash crop to the production. In this case, the company will not only provide the inputs, what they are used to, but also the seeds and the trainings, and they will also purchase the cash crop that comes out of it. Sustainability has a different connotation in different regions. So for these Chinese transactions, we hired a local consultant to look at the sustainability profile of this production, and we embedded some, say, tangible milestones to ensure that it's really going to be say, regenerative. As you can see, it's quite a diversified range of transactions, but the key here for us is that for all these transactions, the business model works for the client, whether it's the farmer or whether it's the corporate entity, the fertilizer company, there is a business case to be made. And we think it's important because that ensures that there is a continuous support for these kind of transformations. It's not been an easy journey for us, to be honest, both internally and externally. There were a few challenges. So one is if you are seeking public support like we did when we were looking for investors for the Agri3 fund, it's complicated to explain why a commercial bank like Rabobank needs to be supported. There is really a different language and an understanding between public partners, so the government, but also impact fund managers, commercial bankers and our clients. So you really have to bridge the language gaps. At deal level, I think it's often underestimated, but there are just not ready to be financed projects that tick all the boxes, so you will. So it's really about creating jointly with our clients. And that takes
I'm going to say thank you very much at this point. So we have more space for a discussion.
Sure, yeah.
And you were talking about what's going on in China, what Rabobank is doing there. So I just want to see if Dr. Fang is back with us. Sam, can we just bring Dr. Fang up into the main screen, please, and see if we've got a good line with her. Because we cut you off in the beginning because of technical issues, Dr. Fang. Are you there with us? I wanted to ask you, we've heard a lot about how China has addressed climate emissions and its very ambitious targets for net zero by 2060, but it's done so largely, so far as I know, by focusing on the energy sector, on the transport sector, on big infrastructure projects. Can you tell us what the Chinese government and authorities are doing in agriculture to reduce emissions? Do we have a connection with Dr. Fang? Oh dear, I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen, about all the gremlins in our system. So instead, I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience. And here's an interesting one. It says, how does the average farmer access blended finance schemes? You know, look at it from the farmer point of view. Is there a connection? Ajay Virjakar, could I ask you that? No luck. So then I'll put it to Agnes Johan from Rabobank. You were talking to us from the top, at the top level, what you're doing and bringing in other sources of finance, but how does the average farmer access it?
Yeah, can you hear me or not?
I can certainly hear you, but I can't.
Good. So Rabo finances farmers directly, right? So those farmers we approach actively, and we bring them, we discuss with them, what are your biggest challenges? Where do you need support? So pasture land renovation is, of course, quite a big thing to tackle for quite a lot of farmers in our Brazilian portfolio. But I have to say, those are only the largest farmers that are around, because that's what we focus on as a bank. Reaching out to the smaller farmers, and then in Brazil, small is relative, but if we talk Africa, it's really small. How do you actually reach out and ensure that they're going to be embedded in some kind of, or have access to finance? It's much more complicated. The last mile delivery, as we call it, is really, really complex. What we do as a international big bank is that we work often with aggregators, as we call them. So these are either aggregators providing inputs, or we work with the buying companies. So we did a transaction with a coffee trading company who saw that for his smallest farmers, he needed access to finance, specifically on the long-term finance. And there we set up basically a portfolio that has been made available to this trading company, who then on-lends to its suppliers. As Rabo, we also have partner banks, as we call them. These are local banks in Africa and in South America. Those have the retail capacity. And for them, you could also structure say, more portfolio-based risk sharing. But it's a crucial question, eh? How do you reach the really, really, really smaller farmers? And we bet as Rabo, but I guess multiple people do that, on the digitalization, because it would just really reduce the transaction cost, as we call it, for the bank. How do you to reach to all these farmers?
And Dita Nuanelli, can I ask you for your perspective on that? How do these wonderful sounding schemes actually reach the people who really need them?
The first reality is that they're not reaching the people. That's the reality. And they're not reaching them in the ways they should. But where they are, it's really through intermediary organizations and demand-driven models. So I'll give you a quick example. I wear many hats, and one of them is that I run Sahel Consulting. And for the last few years, Sahel has been investing in dairy in Nigeria. And in the climate community, dairy is often viewed as the most defaulting organization sector. But what we've done through something called the Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria project, funded by the Gates Foundation, is partner with 6 local dairy processors that are committing to sourcing milk locally. And we basically gotten nomadic communities into clusters, gotten them to settle, provided them with solar-powered boreholes, access to training, feed and fodder, industries, vet care, and then we're linking them to the off-taker, who is the processor, the dairy processor. Now, the first step is financial literacy. Most of these dairy processors, these smallholder farmers, don't have bank accounts, don't have digital accounts, are completely cut off from the financial sector. So we're getting them registered, they're getting bank accounts or digital accounts, and then they start supplying milk, right? And as they start supplying milk to the dairy processor in a climate-friendly way, managing all the externalities, then they start building a track record, and then we're putting them into self-help groups and enabling them to become entrepreneurs. And then they can access the type of blended finance that Rabobank and others are offering through their dairy processor, which is an SME, a critical actor in the agriculture value chain that serves as the off-taker and also propels the behavior change that you want to see in the farmer because they're guaranteed a demand for their milk. And I think these type of ecosystem solutions where there's a policy dimension, you're engaging farmers, you're prioritizing women, and you're putting climate at the center are what are really required to scale. So that you're looking at an entire value chain and you're disrupting that value chain through a multi-pronged approach. And that's what we're doing in Nigeria, and it's working. We're working in 5 states. It's demand-driven, it's private sector-led with an enabling environment. And I'd like to see many of these models replicated across Africa.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very clear. I'm going to try one more time and see if we can join Dr. Fang. Sam, can you try and put Dr. Fang full screen into our discussion? I want to ask you, Dr. Fang, because we cut you off earlier, can you tell us what China is doing to try and reduce emissions in the agriculture sector? We know it's doing very important things in terms of other emissions, in industrial emissions and power in the power sector, but what is going on in agriculture? And it doesn't look like we're having success. Any luck with getting her? No, it's frozen again. What can I say, ladies and gentlemen? These are the perils of trying to having international conversations in this time. Okay, so I'm going to follow up on that question, that point that you made, Ndidi, and then put it also to Agnes Johan. And that is, we know that there are a number of good projects on the ground that have been shown to work. We've done a lot of the thinking and the practice, but how do we scale this up? How do we make sure that it reaches the extent that it needs to reach? Ndidi?
The first step is really broad-based education. And I think Nourishing Africa, which is another platform I founded with 600 agri-businesses, and I hope is 1 million, is one approach. Creating ecosystem solutions requires ecosystem partnerships. And we need to rethink our food ecosystem to ensure that these ecosystem partnerships involve the climate community. Historically, we've excluded the climate community, the health community, the nutrition community, the agriculture community. It's time in each of our countries to actually have ecosystem actors working together, educating, speaking together, and shaping policy together. Ultimately, NISA, education of the entrepreneurs, of the SMEs is critical. Educating the policymakers at the national, state, and local level, and then really empowering champions, because lessons, best practices can only be scaled when you have an enabling environment. And those champions are critical at the policy level, because there have to be incentives for those who are doing the right thing, and disincentives or punishment for people who are violating the trends that we want to see, the positive trajectory. And unless we create those incentives and disincentives, we're not going to change behavior. We also need to empower consumers, because they have to be supporting and demanding food and products from companies that are doing the right thing. And when we celebrate those companies and consumers are demanding for the products and services, we're also going to see a change in behavior and a lot more scaling. And then finally, finance. And I'm sure that Rabobank will take that on. We need catalytic finance, we need patient capital, and we need investors who are willing to take risks and who are willing to deploy resources.
Okay, Ndidi, I'm going to take the speaker's mic away from you now. We will go to Rabo for a response to that, but first I'm going to try fingers and toes crossed to connect with Dr. Fang in Beijing. Dr. Fang, sorry about all these communication problems. Can we get her full screen to join us all? So we were hearing from you about the commitments. Yes, good, we have you. We were hearing from you about the commitments that the Chinese government has made. They're very ambitious. The kind of things that have gone on in terms of industrial emissions being cut, the power sector, those big projects. But what is going on in the ag sector, which is also such an important part of the greenhouse gas problem?
It is a really good question. Traditionally, people more emphasize on industry energy. However, right now, it is time to more emphasize on consumption area. China is also a biggest consumption country. WRI is helping China to do the green supply chain research. That is a soft commodity, which is related to agriculture. And also domestically, we also consider about the food loss and waste, since that is a huge number. So in China, that is a redlining for farmland. So that is a protect the farmland, not use.
We're having problems with the line again. I think Dr. Fang has frozen. So until I get the all clear on that, I'm going to ask Agnes Johan from Rabobank to tell us how we can scale up the amount of finance coming into things like blended finance projects. We know there's no shortage of funding out there looking for important things to invest in. Most of it, when it's interested in the eco world, is going into power stations, is going into new transport systems. It's not going into agriculture. How do you make the case to the pots of money out there that agriculture is an important area for ESG finance?
That's a very good question. So indeed, there's lots of money pending and waiting. And I think, well, what we saw over the last 2 years while we were working on setting up the fund is that there is a big mismatch between expectations of, say, donors, governments, or NGOs or foundations when they are looking for agricultural projects and what can they expect in terms of impact. First of all, there's no standardization at all about sustainable agriculture. That's really early days. But you have them in lots of other parts of ENS, but for agriculture, there's no standardization just yet. So we're working with that with UNEP. We need standardization because it means that you can actually quickly repeat transactions, whether it's with lots of smaller farmers or whether it's with 2 or 3 or 5 big farmers, it doesn't matter. Then secondly, I think the impact world has always looked for, say, the perfect project, right? It needs to tick all the boxes. And I think if we talk about agriculture, we really should focus on transformation. So making tiny baby steps towards regenerative agriculture with a lot of farmers creates a lot of impact as well. It's a different mindset, but that's how we at Rabo approach it. We need to create scale, if only for our own business model. It doesn't work if we can only do 2 transactions per year. We need to scale up. So we're really seeking more standardized product loans and rolling it out to our farmers directly, but also then rolling it out to the farmers who are banked by our partner banks. And those might not be the only, say, certified organic tiny projects. These are large farmers who are in normal agricultural practices, we call them normal now, who need to transform into more sustainable ways. And I think that understanding with all the stakeholders around is crucial going forward.
Agnes Johan, thank you very much. And what you were saying about tiny baby steps, I think leads us very nicely onto this question from Devisha Podar, who sent it in via YouTube. And I hope that we've got Ajay Veer Jakhar back on the line with us. That's what I'm being told. Ajay, I'm going to put this question to you if you're with us. And that is, are top-down or bottom-up approaches more feasible in agricultural practice when we're trying to create change? Ajay Veer Jakhar, do we have the line to you? Did you hear the question I put to you from you?
I really think
it's a really bad line. I think I'm going to put that question to Ndidi Nweneli because we're just not connecting with Ajay. Clearly the signal where you are in Delhi is not that robust. So Ndidi, I don't know if you heard what I said. It's a question saying, top down or bottom up, which is more practical, which is more feasible at this point in this juncture with these big ambitions ahead of us?
I think we need both, and it really varies by context. I think in some contexts, you're not going to make any progress if you come with a top-down approach. You need to really build up from the bottom with local ownership and local direction that's really tailored to the needs on the ground. Like we've seen with our dairy project, we need local leaders, we need local associations, we need religious leaders, we need state governments, but then you also need in some circumstances, top down, especially where there's a need for policy or incentives or funding or a direction, a new direction. And I think we're going to see both, and we need to be comfortable with both approaches, depending on what we're trying to change, what circumstance, what context, what country. And in Africa, with 54 countries, you see different approaches working in different contexts, tied to cultural and historical approaches. Ultimately, though, as I said in the past, we need to put farmers at the center and consumers at the center to drive the behavior changes that we expect.
Thank you so very much, Ndidi Nweneli. I'm going to say thank you to everyone who is still on the line with us, Ndidi, Dr. Fang, Agnes Johan, and Ajay Veer Jakhar. I'm going to give the last shout to people who've been sending us questions and comments to wrap up our session. Edward Davey wanted to put a point to Dr. Fang about diets in China. Are they going to change? Is it realistic to expect China to eat less meat as it becomes richer? It's a key question for all of us around the world. Saskia Rotshusen says, what potential is there in developing a global agricultural carbon market to incentivize farmers towards regenerative farming? Is that viable? What are the obstacles? And Fabio Liepert was very impressed with Ajay Veer Jakhar's opening statement and the barriers that he outlined. If you remember, he outlined 4 or 5 big questions. And he was particularly taken by the point about why do farmers farm in unsustainable ways? Because they were taught to do so. How can we change that? Where does the responsibility lie to make sure that small farmers in poor parts of the world can change the way they do things? Because it's really not their fault. Ladies and gentlemen, I've had great pleasure in being your moderator. Hope that you have enjoyed this session despite all the technical gremlins. It's important that we speak and that we continue to communicate and have these kind of rich dialogues going all the way through 2021. You know what an important year it is. So why don't you follow us on social media, on FOLU? We've got many other panels coming up today. You can jump into those too. Why not sign up to our newsletter right now? I'm Nisha Pillay. It's been a pleasure being with you. Until the next time, goodbye for now.